Have you heard the man who's like, oh?
No.
He's like, oh. Like it's
Thank you.
It's like no. I'll see if I can find the song.
Come on. What is that? It's like a cow.
It's like.
Hi, I'm Jacob Kenny.
And I'm Liam McPherson.
It's the newest edition of your pilot's favorite podcast.
It's
Speech from the Throne, episode 21.
We're here to bring you the latest and greatest from the halls of power.
But not with another multi-million-dollar superhero film canceled right before it's supposed to hit theaters. We're just here to argue.
Hey, Jacob, what are we arguing about today?
Well, Liam, I was listening back to the podcast last week as I was editing it, and when we were talking about the papal apology for residential schools. And when we were talking, you and I, we got pretty heated. And I believe that we may have left the listeners with an impression that I really want to disabuse them of. The idea that perhaps we are anti-religious, or the idea that we are not as respectful of religious Canadians as perhaps we need to be. And there was one particular moment, something that you said, in fact, that got me thinking that maybe we need to do a whole other podcast on this. It was when you were talking about the last vestiges of the church still influencing our state. And that was when you were talking about the issue of Catholic schools. Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario still have publicly funded Catholic schools. And you have made it very clear that you're against this, that you think there's an antiquated system of education, that it just should be a centralized, publicly funded education board that's secular schools.
That's right.
This is something I completely disagree with. Not only do I think that the state should continue to fund Catholic schools, but I actually think that we should expand the idea of religious education to all denominations. I know, Liam, I know you're going to be annoyed, but see, there's a strong reason for this. I think the left believes that religion is a problem, that social conservative people act socially conservative because they're religious. But I think that's a little ahistorical. For most of our history, it's actually the religious side that has been on the left of political issues. The whole idea, in fact, of moral progress comes from the Abrahamic religions. And so I think that the reason why people are acting socially conservative is not because they're too religious, it's actually because they don't understand their religion well enough. And that if we had better funded, centralized, state-backed religious education, people would have more arguments available to them for progressive causes than just the current secular, semi-Marxist arguments that we have right now. So, for instance, right now there's plenty of Christian extremists who would say things like, oh, Jesus would support gun rights. Well, that's ridiculous. Anyone that knows Christianity well enough can say that, the man that said to turn the other cheek, or the Bible that says in Isaiah chapter 2 verse 4 that we should beat our swords into plowshares clearly does not support a hugely armed society. In fact, for most of Christian history, Christianity was taught to discourage violence, to encourage people to be pacifist by nature.
Unless you read the Old Testament, in which case they mention that adulterous women must be stoned, but I suppose that's a whole other podcast.
Certainly. I'm not going to defend everything that's in that book. But we can do other religions as well. So, for instance, I see this on the right as a talking point that we shouldn't bring Muslims into the country because they have really regressive attitudes towards women. Well, I think if there's two Muslims that are talking about, oh, we need to be more oppressive against women because women are more oppressed in our home country, you can actually fight back. There are feminist Muslims who use the Quran as proof that Islam is actually very feminist. So there's lines like in the second chapter of the Quran that says, they, your wives, are your garment, and you are a garment for them. And in fact, Islam has a history. It was one of the first organized religions that allowed women inheritance and legal rights independent of their marital status. It's actually very, very progressive in terms of giving women's rights. So if you're a Muslim, you don't have to promote feminism because it's a Western concept. You can actually promote feminism on Islamic grounds as well. Hindus, same thing. So there's a lot of Hindus in India right now who are being led by Modi and the BJP. They're fighting against Muslims in India. They're organizing pogroms. They're very violent. And there's worries that, if we bring too many Hindus into the country, that we'll just import the same violence. But that's not the case, because if you're a Hindu and one of your Hindu friends says, we want to go beat up some Muslims in the neighborhood, you can say, no. In our religion, in Hinduism, Atman equals Brahman. The soul of God is the essence of all things and beings. So attacking someone else is just attacking yourself. And Hinduism has a long history of peacefully integrating Muslims and Zoroastrians, Syriac Christians, and Buddhists. India, for centuries, has been the most pluralistic society on earth. So you don't have to support pluralism just because it's a Western secular value. It's actually a Hindu one. So these are three different examples where there are, in religious communities, I don't doubt, there are socially conservative currents. But in all three of those communities, there are religious arguments you can use to challenge the social conservative currents. You do not need to tap into secular left thinking to challenge the religion. You actually can use religious arguments to support leftist policies. The problem is these are not arguments that can ever be fully elaborated upon in a secular education curriculum. These are things that will only arrive to you after years and decades of study. For me, I'm someone that's taken many world religious courses, but these are things I still have to look up in order to, write a podcast about this. I haven't studied these religions for so long that I could possibly memorize these quotations and bring them back in any sort of, effective political argument. But if we're going to stop the cultural conversation from moving too much to the socially conservative side, this is what we need people to do. We cannot just rely on the idea that a secular curriculum is going to prevent people from being radicalized. We actually have to give people religious arguments in their own religious tradition to fight back against the radicals in their own communities. If we just hope that a secular education will de-radicalize people, I think we're missing the point, because the secular part of the education doesn't speak to your real religious values. And so if we're going to have a pluralistic society with many different religions, I think it's incumbent upon the state to fund religious education for those communities to ensure that everyone in that community is on the same page, following a mainstream religious interpretation so that they have the arguments necessary to fight back against the radicals in their own community. If we ignore this fact, if we just let people educate themselves in their religion and only focus on teaching them, science and mathematics, we're taking a chance as to whether or not the community can be taken over by radicals. And as we've seen, particularly in the Protestant movement in the United States, once the radicals take over a significant faction, they can be very dangerous. So that's my argument for religious education, and I'm very interested to hear your counter-arguments.
Well, the first thing that I want to make eminently clear is, to everybody listening, I obviously support anybody's right to their freedom of religion, and I support anybody practicing whichever religion they choose. The reason that I have been so historically against publicly funded religious schools is because historically, and again, doesn't mean it has to be in the future, but historically, the establishment running those schools is conservative and regressive. There are exceptions. There are a number of Ottawa area Catholic schools that have embraced LGBTQ rights, for example. You can evolve. It's not impossible, but I also know of many Catholic schools in that province. I don't know as much about the Catholic schools in Alberta and Saskatchewan and the three territories, but in Ontario, I know of many schools and I've met many students who are I call friends, who have gone to those schools who had quite a conservative experience there. They were taught that being gay wasn't part of God's plan. They were told at 13 that music was too sexy and women had to raise families and be traditional, and they had priests begging them to not ever get an abortion when they would go to masses, which, by the way, were compulsory. You didn't have a choice. You had to go to the masses. And it's just, I think it's the idea of the imposition of that by an establishment that is antiquated.
You don't like the idea of Catholic schools is that you don't like what was taught in them, which understandable.
It's oppressive, regressive, and harmful stuff that
the truth
people
is,
should not be learning.
If Catholic schools were abolished and everyone went to a public school, but the social conservatives still took over the province, they would change the curriculum to something you also didn't like.
That's certainly possible,
so it's
too.
It's not just possible. I mean, I lived in the province of Alberta, where we were essentially taught that climate change has positives and negatives, and that evolution was just a theory. Like, there was lots of, and Jason Kenney tried to to push changes that were even more extreme.
Oh, that I'm aware of,
thankfully
yes.
are sort of being challenged. But there's always a possibility that if social conservatives control an institution, it's going to teach socially conservative things.
I'm not saying it's not possible for religious education to be progressive, but then the other side of it, which is a principle for me, is I find that when the state is funding anything, religion shouldn't ever be one of them. That to me goes over the line of separating church and state. You know, we argued in the last episode that it was time to tax religious institutions, and now I'm a little surprised, Jacob, but everybody thinks differently, but I'm a little surprised that now this doesn't apply with education. In fact, it's much the reverse with education. And I understand, but here's the thing is
I guess I'll have to start from the beginning here when you talk about the separation of church and state, because the progenitor of that idea was not secular politicians. It was the church itself that was arguing for a separation of church and state in the Middle Ages. And the idea was to carve out a realm that was independent from state control. So in the Middle Ages, the church, not only did they have their own tax system, they had their own court system, and essentially they were the only university or knowledge production center. And so when I say I want to tax the church, I am definitely challenging the separation of church and state. That's because I believe in a state where the church is included in it. We, as individuals, all form the collective state, and that there is nothing underneath that state control that should not be negotiated somehow. That there is not really any part of human social life that shouldn't at least touch the state. That doesn't mean that the state needs to have total control, but if you separate the institution entirely from the state, you're just serving the interests of that institution.
Well, I'm in complete agreement with you about taxing churches, but I'm actually saying that by taxing churches, instead of exempting them as we have historically for decades, you are separating church and state. Because the reason that exemption existed in the first place was as a favor by the state to the church.
Okay, sure, but what that means is you're
so thereby that's not a separation. That's the state giving the church goodies.
If you're saying that the church must follow the law that's written by the state, there is no separation of church and state. The church has become an organ of the state.
I suppose so, expressly by being taxed. So if you're arguing it from that standpoint, then I suppose I agree. But we agree on that issue. So why are we retreading this issue?
Now that we agree, I'm trying to think of what's the logical conclusion from this. So it's like that.
Well, we agreed last episode, though. What you're trying to achieve with your argument is noble, and I agree that there are ways that we can stamp out de-radicalization, and some of that can be done at the faith level, because people already have those religious communities to go to. They might even go to Sunday school or whatever version of that is for them. And I have to say that my issue with the way you're trying to achieve it is not only is there already a faith-based community, and the faith-based communities can sometimes be more regressive, sometimes they can be less regressive. It varies from faith-based community to faith-based community. But there are genuine socioeconomic needs that need to be met there, particularly if you're talking about for new immigrants, that we're not meeting. You're suggesting that we, instead of taking away funding from an antiquated model of running Catholic schools with public funds, you want to create more of them so we have even less money to spend if we need it to solve those socioeconomic issues. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be any sort of cultural outreach at all. On the contrary, we should always be doing cultural outreach, and we should always be trying to be more inclusive. Like, there's an old friend of mine that I knew growing up here, and she was upset because, like, some people here are very conservative because it's very homogenous out here in Nova Scotia outside of the city. It's quite Caucasian. And so this friend was upset that her granddaughter's assembly had been changed to like the holiday assembly or something instead of the Christmas assembly. And it's like, it's not called the Christmas assembly anymore. And she was like genuinely upset by this. That's like the most minor cultural outreach you could do. It's a wide spectrum, but I think you should be including I'm not a teacher, so I can't outline a whole curriculum, but I think you should be including ideas about faith younger than we are and teaching kids about different religions younger than we are. I don't think kids should be going to institutions that are affiliated with those religious institutions. I don't think we have nearly enough knowledge about religion, which is why we have the biases we do it. I mean, look after 9/11, the racism and the biases that the Muslim community was faced with and still is faced with to this day, the repercussions of that event for them because of a complete misunderstanding of religion. There needs to be a better understanding. I don't think the way to achieve that when we have so many other socioeconomic needs to address, I don't think the solution is to establish a bunch more boards with a bunch more billions of dollars coming out of the taxpayer's wallet. I don't think that's the solution. And that sounds awfully conservative of me, but it's, that's just what I think about that particular issue.
Okay, well, that's something I want. I don't know why you think that's going to cost that much money.
Because the current system costs billions. The current system costs billions in Ontario. Billions.
Yeah, but if you would, you're dumping responsibility on other communities. That's inevitably, they're going to have to pay for a lot of it themselves as well.
Well, what a terrible thing to dump on municipalities when they're trying to just ditch car culture. It's
not ditching on municipalities. I'm ditching it on the specific religious community. They already
you'd be asking them to pay for it as well.
Well, some of it. They're going to have more control over what their children learn. Of course, that's going to cost something. It's not a.
So in a way, the Vatican offers funding to Catholic schools, that.
Well, exactly. It's cheaper to run Catholic schools than it is to run public schools.
I thought you were asking. At first, I thought you were going to ask parishioners to pay. I was like. What? Parishioners aren't going to want to.
Well,
private school
you're
level,
absolutely right. Parishioners are the ones that are going to be paying. It's the community that's gonna pay, but they want to expand the religion, so of course they're going to pay for it.
So then why would I, as the state, be helping you expand your religion? That's not the state's role. That's why I'm fundamentally against it. I'm fundamentally against that.
I don't think there's a world that exists without religion.
Well, no.
So if religion's going to be here, I'd rather it be a good religion that the state can work with, a religion that is not against the state, versus whatever random radical pagan religion can come out of the woodwork and potentially attack the state.
And that's certainly true. There's truth to that.
So what I'm saying is, when it comes to those, so in Christianity and Islam and Hinduism, all of these religions have the ability to be really stabilizing for the state. If you select the right strain and teach and proselytize that strain, not only can that strain be socially progressive, but it can also be super helpful in cohering the state and keeping us peaceful.
No, I get it.
But if we let it do randomly, it could become something way more violent and way more destructive. The truth is, although in this time and place, we do think of church fathers as being socially regressive, this is just not the case historically, and it certainly is not the case in Islam and Hinduism, in the religions of the people that are most likely to come to Canada in the future. So essentially, Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism in history, they all have fundamentally the same conflict in their societies, where the imams, the priests, and the Brahmin, the intellectual elites that live in cities, and for most of their history, they're socially progressive. They're enlightened. They are the experts of that time, the scientists of that time. And they're fighting against the socially conservative, superstitious barbarians that live in the countryside. And there's always this push and pull. But because everyone recognized that the priests had this cultural center of knowledge, this preservation of ancient knowledge, they were willing to listen to them, even if they had social ideas they didn't necessarily agree with. And so for most of our, let's say the last 1400 years, in all three of these societies, it was the religious institutions that not only were a really important stabilizing factor in the society, but actually that pushed more progressive values. It's actually in our secular age, as we have destroyed these religious institutions, that they have fragmented, and the social conservative barbarian peoples that these churches were trying to keep back have taken over some of the religious institutions. So particularly with Islam, for example, the Ottoman Empire, the Arab Caliphate before it, had a very centralized, controlled madrasa system where everyone was learning basically the same idea of Islam. Then with Western colonialism, we destroyed the caliphates, so there's no central control of the madrasas. And now, those basically backwards peoples, like the Saudis, for example, took over, and they're importing socially conservative stuff that if we were talking in the Prophet's day, Muhammad, peace be upon him, would be absolutely against what these guys are pushing. It's simply because we destroyed the religious institution that they've become more socially conservative. So right now, in these immigrant communities, they're mostly westernized people. They're mostly the elites that came first because it's really expensive to immigrate to Canada. But we can't expect that this is going to be the same way, particularly with climate change, with all of the conflicts that are happening and are bound to happen because of climate change. More and more people are going to be here just randomly. They're going to be here because they have nowhere else to come. And those people are not necessarily people that are going to share those westernized values. And so my concern is, I think we need to be giving control back to these intellectual elites who for the last 1400 years have been holding back this socially conservative wave. And the only way we can do that is by giving them their traditional power, which was over education. If we can get everyone in that community on the same page, listening, once again, to their experts. And again, their experts are religious experts for the most part.
Yes, but aren't they already having these conversations in their religious institutions with their respective...
Absolutely.
So, and I know they're up against different resistance.
The problem is that the radicals are winning. The radicals are winning that conversation.
I know, but do we know that that's happening at every single religious institution, though? Like, do we know that it's happening at every single place that you go, or is it just some imams in some regions?
The vast majority of Muslims, the vast majority of Hindus, the vast majority of Christians are perfectly normal people.
Oh, no, well yeah, obviously.
It's just because there's no centralized religious power that has a more formal control of the religious education. It has allowed for more radical, and to be honest, it's not just, I shouldn't say the word radical because radical, it means the root. They're not really radical. They're more just crazy people. They're people that are making shit up. They're pagans in real words. They're people that call themselves Christians or call themselves Muslims, but they don't know anything about the religion. And they're taking over in the fringes, and they're much more energetic than they ever would have been when things were more centralized and religious education was more formalized. And so my worry is there is the potential for a huge amount of violence because there's so much religious fracturing going on in these three religions. They're going to solve these disputes in a violent way, but the state can prevent it. The state can put its finger on the scale and try to structure religious education once again, so that everyone, no matter the religious community, is forced, more or less, back into a religious consensus. Because right now, it's not going to happen without some sort of violent struggle. The religious consensus has broken apart, and this is sort of the world where we're going towards, where people are getting more and more radicalized, more and more extreme, and I genuinely worry that this is the direction we're going towards, another 30 years war, but rather than just Christians fighting Christians, it's going to be a 30 years war with like hundreds of different potential factions against each other from a wide variety of religions. But that's not the way it has to be. Religion is supposed to be a stabilizing force, but it has to work in tandem with the state in order to do that. If it's just a bunch of people like mumbling mumbo-jumbo to each other, it's not going to work. It has to be structured somehow. And because there is no external structure left, because secular colonial governments have destroyed the religious structure all around the world, essentially, that existed before colonial powers came in, we need to find a new way to build that.
But wouldn't some Muslims or some Christians or some Sikhs or some Jews look at you and say, how about you let us try to manage this ourselves? I'm not saying that necessarily they always do the most effective job, but
letting them manage them themselves is killing themselves.
Like any other power struggle, like watching nation states come and go, like watching religion's had its power struggles too, and it's killed billions of people. Billions of people have died and spilled blood over religion. However, billions of people have also united over religion. Mm-hmm. But the point that I'm trying to make, even if I agree that if you take the right strain or whatever as you phrase it, like if you appoint socially progressive members of the religion to the leadership and ensure the state keeps it socially progressive, blah, blah, blah. I get that. I know it's possible, but number one, it still violates that principle of the state and religion, and it's still helping them grow religion. I don't think the state should have any part in growing a religion. I just don't think that. And then when you turn around and sell it to the public, like I'm not saying it's impossible to sell, but you're going to have an extremely hard time asking taxpayers to help pay for tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars worth of costs in setting up these school systems across the country for every single religion that wants one, versus all the other begging socioeconomic needs right now, like our healthcare system and our access to prescription drugs and our ability to put bread on the table. I think there's just more important things.
I think it would have a lot of difficulty convincing the white community for this, but actually I think that immigrant communities would be totally on board. And the reason I believe that is because I've heard rumors that Patrick Brown has more or less promised this to many different of the communities that he signed up. And the reason why I'd have difficulty with white people but not have difficulty with non-white people is that white people, I think, are convinced that the ideal society is a secular one, or that we're ashamed of our Christianity in some way and that we want to move towards secularism, or we think that it's possible to separate church and state. But there's no other civilization in the world that thinks it's possible to separate church and state. A religion, in their mind, in the non-Western mind, is just the way that you organize yourself in your culture and your society. You can't separate that from the state. So when you're saying something like a state promoting a religion violates freedom of religion, well, I think if you're using that sort of logic, then the state having an education curriculum also violates freedom of speech, because the state, in promoting a education curriculum, is trying to change your opinion in some sense. They're not telling you what you can and cannot say, but they are giving you information that's specifically designed to change what you might say in the future.
So I know you're talking about the Judeo-Christian society that we live in the West, and you're absolutely right. So to say that our secular schools are probably going to be at first slightly Judeo-Christian, and that maybe some places have a Christmas assembly when they probably shouldn't call it the Christmas assembly specifically, you're absolutely right. And there's a whole hell of a lot of public schools out there that are quote-unquote secular that have to do a whole lot better job being secular and inclusive. You're absolutely right. But it doesn't mean that there cannot be a secular institution like exists for so many other types of things that could ensure the board continued to be secular and inclusive, could bring in more knowledge of religion, could bring in more cultural knowledge. And again, I'm not saying I know what that specifically might look like, because you're talking to a guy who's like, yes, I guess I am racialized, but I grew up pretty privileged and I don't have insight into that. So I'm not saying I'm the guy who's going to get it done, but I'm saying that I know it can be done, without spending hundreds of billions on a new system.
Yeah, I think that's fundamentally untrue. That there's no such thing.
1 in 3 Canadians would disagree with
secularism
you.
Is a non-starter. When we think of secularism, we're just talking about a religion that's founded on the scientific principle, but it's not any more or less a religion than any other religion. It's just
it's not a religion. It's not a religion. It's just a rough group of people who maybe kind of sort of believe in God, who don't believe in God, who don't know if there's a God, who want to run things away from religion. It could even be religious people who want to run things without the influence of a religious institution. I think that's very simple. And you say secularism is a non-starter. There's dozens of private sector corporations right now that are completely secular, and they might be influenced by actions that are Judeo-Christian in some way, or they might donate to a political cause of somebody who's religious in some way or Judeo-Christian in some way. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but they're sure as hell not making employees go to mass after the meeting.
So this is why I'm going to say that secularism doesn't exist.
Oh, come on.
If we were in the Middle Ages, if we were in the Middle Ages, if we were wanted to know, like, I don't know, why the sun sets every day, we would ask the priest, because the priest has magical knowledge. He reads the ancient language of Latin that's preserved all of the old wisdom from the past. He would look in the Bible, which is the source of all information, and he would tell us and translate to us why the sun sets every day. So if you and I today have that same question, we go to a scientist. A scientist has learned all of the magical language of science that you and I cannot understand. He's read all of the studies that you and I cannot understand, and then he translates the study in a way that we can understand. It's exactly the same function. Now, the scientific method is definitely a way better way of determining predictions and determining truths about the universe than just some guy in the desert having a dream 2,000 years ago. I totally agree with that. But it's not perfect. The scientific method cannot prove itself. You still have to have a fundamental doubt. And fundamentally, you and I were not scientists. We still have to trust that the scientists are telling us something. So it's all really based on faith. Us trusting the institutions, and it's the same thing in religions too, because you can say, well, you can replicate the scientific studies. Well, a priest would say, you can also learn to read the Bible and can also theoretically come across this knowledge yourself. If you follow the method, you'll always...
But there's a huge damn difference between the Bible and rigorous scientific methods, which are imperfect, and the science improves because that's the nature of it. It's not always rock solid all the time. That's true. But it's a lot more rock solid. It's a lot more rock solid. It's a lot more rock solid than a lot of the religious stuff I hear. And again, if you want to practice that and you want to do that, that's your own thing. I don't think that the state should be associated with that. That's what I keep coming back to.
Yes, but for thousands of years, Liam, the church was the best possible answer, and
but it's
and
not
you would have
anymore,
said
though.
if we were having the same argument, you would have said, well, the church always gets everything right, so why are we challenging it? So
absolutely, maybe some other institution will come around in 2,000 years that's better than science. I don't know, but right now science is the best we've got, so we should always go with the best we've got.
So I do think that, and this is why I'm also an atheist in a second, I do think science is the best religion we have. But I don't think it's anything less than a religion. And more importantly, I think that this is not a religion that's going to become more adopted as the future goes on. When it comes to converting people to this religion, if it's a religion, it was very easy to do this in the last century when people could use the scientific method to learn secrets about the universe that made them more productive. So they could suddenly grow their economies, they could grow their societies, they could increase their population. But nowadays, particularly if you're coming from the global south, I think you're seeing science more as the cause of your misery than necessarily the source of your solutions. Science is the reason why their populations exploded way greater than their resource base could support. Science is the reason why everyone could blow themselves up in a nuclear apocalypse tomorrow. Science is the reason why we have this industrial revolution that could end up poisoning the planet for future generations. And so I suspect that rather than more people adopting your religion and my religion of science, they're going to adopt the older religions of the past. And that's why we need to stop focusing our arguments on experts and on a scientific secular curriculum, because that's a curriculum that is not going to make sense for the vast majority of people in the future. More people are going to be turning towards religion as the world gets worse. It's just almost inevitable. And so we need to start working on religious arguments for our political ideology if our political ideology is going to survive. If we continue to make purely scientific arguments and rely on an education system that is supposed to be teaching people about science, we are losing the game. Because that's what we've been doing. I mean, our education system is supposed to be teaching people about scientific facts. It's supposed to be teaching people, but for some reason, it's not getting through to them. For some reason, there's this huge sliver of people that cannot be penetrated by this knowledge. And I suspect it's because we're arguing on terms they just don't accept. We're making secular terms to people that don't believe in this sort of thing. They believe in their religion. So we need to actually start talking about the stuff that they believe in, which is their religion. And if we keep talking about science, your arguments are landing on deaf ears, essentially.
I get everything you're saying. I just keep disagreeing purely on the basis that I think there's other ways to accomplish the things that you want to do without doing it the way that you want to do it. And perhaps I could be wrong, but that's how I feel based on the evidence that's available.
I guess it's just what counts as knowledge, because in our Western culture, yes, science is knowledge. But in other cultures around the world, religion is still the bastion of their knowledge.
True.
And so if we are to be a pluralistic society, I don't think we can possibly make a curriculum that doesn't include their religions in it. But at the same time, because you have this gut reaction to teaching, religious knowledge in a secular curriculum, I also don't suspect that especially the white population would accept just huge religious portions in their school. I don't think that we'll ever get to a point where people will be able to learn about their own religion with enough depth of knowledge to make it useful to them before it makes that knowledge either irrelevant or almost dangerous for the other people that aren't of their religion to learn at the same time. In order to make these arguments, in order to be solidly rooted in your own religious tradition, you need to spend a huge portion of your life dedicated to learning about it. And I don't think it's possible in a huge pluralistic society like ours for every single person to learn that much information about every other religion at the same time. I think the most you can possibly learn is a very superficial view of everyone else's religion, which sort of makes the global secular curriculum irrelevant in that case.
Well, what I was going to add is that some Ontario Catholic schools, and again, my knowledge is based largely in Ontario's system because that's where I spend a lot of time. Some Ontario Catholic schools do have world religion courses. Religion is mandatory throughout high school, but it doesn't get to world religion until grade 11 or 12, if I recall correctly. So grade 9 and 10 are focused purely on Jesus, the Bible, Catholicism, God, like all that stuff. And then I think it's either grade 11 or 12 that they briefly expand. I think it should be far more comprehensive and diversified than this, of course. I do not balk at the idea of teaching world religion in a school. Again, it's the affiliation with the religion that I dislike. And you're absolutely right that we can certainly have a focus on socially progressive members of those religions if those boards are being set up. Nothing is stopping anybody in future from turning those institutions conservative, like some of the ones that exist now. And so that's another risk, you spend the money to set up all those systems and maybe it does satisfy some need, but then what if those institutions go conservative and then the government goes conservative and then you have what you have in the United States, which is sure a lot of quote unquote public schools, but they say the Pledge of Allegiance conscience every day. Some pray, and they've gone after Roe versus Wade now, where it slides into Christo-fascism, you know? So it's like, I'm not saying like that'd be a slippery slope argument to say that's going to happen if we did it in Canada. I'm just saying it's a risk, you know, that the boards could become more conservative.
Well, one of the roots for why the American religious experiment has so failed is that the Americans, you know, they have Protestantism just the same way that the English have, just the same way as English Canadians have it. It's the same strain of stuff. But in Canada and in England, particularly in England, the Church of England maintained rigid central control over religious education for the entire time, whereas in America it was complete free-for-all. There were just infinite branches of different more and more radical religions that kept spreading all over the place. And so the religious conversation in the United States went to the crazies really fast. Because in that conversation, when anyone is allowed to speak, it was always the crazies who had more interesting things to say. In Canada and in Britain, where our religious schools, and remember, until the middle of the 20th century, religious schools were the only schools. Our religious schools were much more centralized. We didn't really have that huge branching out of all these different religious traditions in Protestantism. And I think that's been a huge stabilizing factor in our society because everyone was on the same page. Now, they weren't necessarily on the same page with stuff that we would agree with 100%, but at least they were all more or less agreeing with one another, and they all believed in their own state. Whereas, you know, the Americans were breeding cults that were very against the state and would violently struggle against it, and cults that exist to this very day and perpetrate terrorist activities against abortion clinics to this very day. It's the decentralization of these religions that have made them dangerous. It's not the religion themselves. That's the main argument that I'm trying to make here. And as I said with the freedom of expression, I think that the state trying to influence your religious choices is not an infringement upon the freedom of religious expression. In the same way that the state developing a curriculum is not also infringing upon your freedom of expression. You always have the right to choose whatever religion you want. You always have the right to say whatever you want. But that doesn't mean that the state shouldn't try to influence you to make better decisions with your life. I think that's kind of the state's primary function, in fact, is to try to improve people or to be a socializing force so that everyone understands each other and everyone is in synergy with one another. Because when people aren't on the same page, that's when they get violent.
You'll own nothing and be happy. That's Klaus Schwab, folks. And
the
thing is that these defeated liberal premiers are going around saying that I didn't want to show up to the debate. But the reality is I wanted to show up to the debate. I just wanted to go shore up my vote in Saskatchewan because it was oh so in jeopardy. I had to have a big self-aggrandizing rally in Saskatchewan. And I just wanted everybody to know that. And sorry about that. I have a cold anyway. With that, we live in a society. And I hope...
We do.
You know, Jacob, you didn't take any of what I said personally by any means. It's just I think
deeply personally, I'm profoundly upset. This is probably going to be the last episode. I'm storming off.
And with that, you know, we're calling it off. We hope that the podcast has been a ride to listen to. Unfortunately, it's quite likely that we'll be coerced by our egos into doing another episode next week. So tune in if that happens, which is quite likely. And if you want to get in touch with us, you can reach us at speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. That's all one word, lowercase, speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. And we will see you in the next one.
Bye.